Imagine waking up before dawn, your feet already blistered from yesterday's labor, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp mud. You step outside to tend the same fields your father did, and his father before him, only to find your irrigation canal clogged, the tax collector already approaching in the distance, and your children crying from hunger because your last harvest was taken by the temple. Welcome to life as a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, where misery wasn't a side effect. It was the job description. Before we dig into the gritty truth of ancient Mesopotamian farming, let me ask you, where in the world are you watching from? And how are you today? Drop it in the comments. While you're here, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more unsettling truths from history, and tap that bell so you never miss a story from the shadows of civilization. Now, let's go back 5,000 years to a world where humanity's first fields bore more pain than prosperity. Farming in ancient Mesopotamia, often hailed as the Cradle of Civilization, was far less glorious than history textbooks make it sound. Though the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers offered fertile soil, it came with brutal physical demands, environmental unpredictability, social inequality, and spiritual obligations that made life on the land a cycle of exhaustion, fear, and despair. This so-called cradle was also a cage. To understand why Mesopotamian farmers were trapped in misery, you need to know that agriculture wasn't always a choice. Many of the earliest farmers were former hunter-gatherers, people who were forced into settlement by growing populations and dwindling wild food sources. They traded mobility and variety for soil, sweat, and servitude. Once a community settled, farming quickly became mandatory for survival, but it was far from sustainable on an individual level. Early farmers didn't just plant crops. They had to build entire ecosystems from scratch. Irrigation canals, dikes, and reservoirs to tame the rivers. And this work, it never stopped. The rivers were temperamental, flooding violently or drying up unpredictably. A miscalculated season could ruin an entire village. The act of farming itself was nothing short of torture. Tools were primitive, mostly made of wood, bone, and stone. The plow, pulled by oxen, was a luxury. Most farmers had to break hardened earth with handheld hoes. The sun scorched the fields while insects and disease ran rampant. Imagine spending 14-hour days digging and planting, with no protective clothing, no breaks, and no guarantee that your labor would yield anything edible. Then came irrigation, a blessing and a curse. Sure, the rivers brought life, but they also brought salt. Mesopotamian soil was prone to salinization, especially in southern cities like Ur and Lagash. Every time water flowed through the irrigation canals, it deposited more salt into the soil. Over time, this rendered once fertile fields barren. Crop yields plummeted, and desperate farmers moved to less fertile lands or were forced into debt slavery just to survive. Imagine watching your land slowly die, knowing that each harvest would be worse than the last. But the pain wasn't just physical, it was deeply social. Farmers had the least amount of power in Mesopotamian society. They paid heavy taxes to the temples and palaces, both in labor and in crops. The ziggurats, those towering religious monuments, were often funded and maintained by farmers, who gave up part of their yield and were sometimes conscripted for building projects. If you failed to deliver your quota, you could be fined, beaten, or have your land confiscated. Worse still, you weren't just feeding your family, you were feeding a machine. Theocratic kings and high priests dictated how much land you worked, how much grain you owed, and even which crops to grow. Barley was the most common, but if you were commanded to plant flax for temple robes instead, you had no choice. Your autonomy was a myth. And if your land didn't yield enough, that was considered your failure, not nature's. The gods were blamed, and offerings demanded. Sacrifices, festivals, and rituals, funded by farmers, were supposed to appease the angry deities. So, after a hard day's work, you might still have to join a ritual procession to beg the gods not to destroy your crops. Your family? They worked beside you. Children didn't go to school unless they were from wealthy families. They worked in the fields, ran errands, and carried loads of water or grain under the punishing Mesopotamian sun. Sickness spread fast. Without proper sanitation or medical knowledge, a minor infection could kill. And since most houses were made from mud brick, flash floods or long rains could literally melt your home away. The clay ovens used for baking often sat dangerously close to the living space, causing fires that devoured entire neighborhoods. In a society where survival was a gamble and misery was institutionalized, hope came in strange forms. Occasionally, a good harvest might allow you to keep a little extra. Maybe your children didn't get sick that year. Maybe the tax collector forgot your field. But those were exceptions. Most years, the misery continued uninterrupted. Many farmers resorted to selling off land or even family members to cover debts. A poor harvest could mean slavery. Ancient Mesopotamian legal codes like Hammurabi's show just how common this was. Entire sections are dedicated to land disputes, debts, and runaway slaves. Often farmers who couldn't endure the burden anymore. And what about the future? For a Mesopotamian farmer, it was bleak. Sons inherited their father's debts and land, locked into the same miserable existence. Upper mobility was almost impossible. You couldn't just leave the farm and become a merchant or a scribe. Education was reserved for the elite. The rest were bound to the soil, their backs bent and their hands calloused, fading into history as the unremembered backbone of civilization. So when we think of ancient Mesopotamia and its legendary achievements, writing, astronomy, law codes, we must also remember the cost. Behind every golden artifact and stone tablet was a farmer whose life was defined by suffering, sacrifice, and servitude. The cities rose on the backs of those who toiled in the mud, whose names were never carved in stone, whose voices were drowned by the roar of rivers and the commands of kings. This was segment 1 of our series on why being a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia was miserable. In our next segment, we'll dive deeper into the brutal tax system, temple demands, and what happened when nature turned against the farmer. If you thought endless labor and backbreaking toil were the only miseries ancient Mesopotamian farmers endured, brace yourself, because their real torment came not just from the soil, but from the system. In segment 2, we dive into the cruel machinery of the Mesopotamian economy, a system so exploitative that the very act of farming was like entering a lifelong contract of suffering, fear, and spiritual coercion. Imagine this. After months of sweating under the blazing sun, you finally gather your harvest, but you're not celebrating. Instead, you're calculating exactly how much grain you can keep and how much you're forced to hand over to the temple, the palace, and the bureaucrats who show up without fail. You see, farmers in ancient Mesopotamia were not independent workers, but economic prisoners, chained to their fields by oppressive taxes and tribute systems. The state owned the land, or in many cases, the temple did, and leasing it meant surrendering a massive portion of your yield every season. No matter how bad the weather, how sick your livestock, or how much your children needed to eat. The scribes, those literate elites who kept the records, weren't just documenting your debts, they were enforcing them. A miscount, a delayed payment, or a poor harvest didn't buy you sympathy. It bought you punishment, or worse, bondage. Legal codes, such as Hammurabi's, made it crystal clear. Failure to pay debts could result in your land being taken, your property seized, or your wife and children enslaved until your dues were cleared. And these weren't isolated cases, this was routine. Farmers who couldn't produce enough to meet temple quotas often ended up in debt servitude, working for priests or wealthy landowners who had their own surplus, creating a vicious cycle where the poor got poorer and the rich gained more control over the land. And while the temples were supposed to be spiritual centers, they were the largest landowners and creditors in all of Mesopotamia. Far from being benevolent, they operated like powerful corporations, using religion as leverage to extract labor and resources. Farmers were often required to donate not just crops, but livestock, textiles, or their own labor to temple projects, like maintaining irrigation systems, constructing buildings, or preparing for elaborate religious festivals. These festivals, ironically, celebrated the gods who were supposedly blessing the farmers with fertility and abundance. It was the farmer who bled for every sheaf of barley, while the priest sat in luxury, chanting prayers from behind walls the farmer had helped build. If a flood destroyed your crops, it was said the gods were angry. If a drought came, the gods were punishing you. Either way, you had to offer more. This spiritual manipulation ensured that no matter how hard you worked or how little you had, you never questioned the system. You just worked harder. The taxation didn't stop at crops. Farmers had to contribute materials for state projects like roads, walls, and ziggurats. Even if your harvest was poor, your obligation remained the same. Grain, oil, reeds, even beer, all were considered taxable. Some farmers had a hand over draft animals, which often left them without means to plow the next season's fields. Others were conscripted into corvée labor, meaning they were taken from their homes for weeks or months at a time to work on state-run projects. During this time, their fields lay untended, their families vulnerable, their debts compounding. Imagine being told to abandon your only means of survival to dig canals hundreds of miles away under armed supervision, while your children starved back home. That was reality. And when disaster struck, floods, invasions, or plagues, the farmer bore the burden. Cities could rebuild using taxes and labor forcibly taken from agricultural communities. Priests could still demand offerings. Scribes could still collect records. But the farmer? The farmer's losses were permanent. His home might wash away in a flood. His family might die from famine. His future might vanish with one failed harvest. Even natural cycles turn against him. Soil salinization, caused by irrigation, rendered land infertile over time. Farmers had no choice but to overwork the land, and when the soil gave out, they had to move or lease new land from the temple at even higher rates. The very act of trying to survive ensured future suffering. There are no savings, no seasons of rest. And it wasn't just the body that broke, it was the mind. The psychological toll of farming under such a regime cannot be overstated. You live in constant fear, not just of the unpredictable environment, but of bureaucrats, scribes, tax collectors, and priests who held your fate in ink and scroll. Every harvest was measured. Every mistake was noted. Every ounce of barley was counted. There were clay tablets that recorded how much a farmer owed, how much he paid, and what punishment awaited if he fell short. Your entire life was reduced to numbers in someone else's ledger. And if you dared complain, that too was recorded and punished. Even the communal nature of early Mesopotamian villages offered no real safety. Neighbors might inform on each other to lighten their own burdens. Corruption was rife, and bribes were common among scribes and officials. If someone with more status wanted your land, they could invent a reason to seize it. There were no appeals, no second chances. Justice was for the elite. Even funerals were taxed. When a farmer died, the temple required offerings to ensure their soul reached the afterlife. That meant the surviving family had to work harder, pay more, and give up more grain just to bury their dead with dignity. Misery didn't stop with death. It extended beyond the grave. And yet, despite all this, the myth of the noble agricultural foundation of civilization persisted, largely written by scribes and elites who never dug a trench, who never felt the sting of salted earth or the hunger of a failed season. They documented their own glory, their laws, their gods, and their palaces, while the stories of farmers, the real backbone of Mesopotamia, were buried in the mud they worked every day. The silent majority of the ancient world lived in misery so that a few could live in luxury. So the next time you see a picture of a majestic ziggurat or read about the first great civilization, remember this. None of it would exist without the invisible agony of the Mesopotamian farmer. This was not a life of peaceful tilling and divine blessing. It was a system of endless extraction, spiritual manipulation, and state-sanctioned suffering. And that system ensured that for the common farmer, hope was not a harvest, it was a hallucination. Stay tuned for segment 3, where we'll explore how nature itself, through floods, heat waves, and a looming threat of famine, made every single day on a Mesopotamian farm a test of survival. If crushing taxes and social injustice weren't enough, Mesopotamian farmers also had to battle an even more unpredictable and merciless enemy, nature itself. In this third segment of our deep dive into why being a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia was nothing short of a nightmare, we explore how the environment turned on them at every possible opportunity, making every harvest a gamble, every season a threat, and every single day a ticking clock toward either survival or starvation. Picture this. Your entire livelihood depends on two raging rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, beasts that one day give life and the next day swallow it. These rivers, while celebrated in modern history books for allowing civilization to bloom, were uncontrollable forces of nature that frequently flooded without warning, overflowing irrigation ditches, drowning crops, and eroding fields. There were no modern levees, no satellite forecasts, just anxious eyes staring at the sky and water levels, hoping this wouldn't be the year the river decided to devour everything. A flash flood could sweep away months of labor in minutes. But the opposite was just as terrifying. Droughts, which were common in the southern plains of Sumer, left entire regions parched. With no rain and reduced river flow, irrigation canals turned into cracked veins in the earth. Crops withered, livestock perished, and families slowly starved. A bad year meant misery, but two in a row could mean death. And when the weather did behave, the land still turned against its caretakers. The more farmers irrigated their land, the more they unknowingly doomed themselves. Repeated irrigation led to a buildup of salt in the soil, a problem we now call salinization. Over the decades, the fertile land near cities like Ur and Eridu became white, salty wastelands where barley refused to grow. The more they tried to save their fields with water, the more they poisoned the earth. But what choice did they have? To leave meant abandoning everything. To stay meant fighting a losing battle against invisible minerals stealing the life from the soil. And then there were the pests. Insects like locusts and weevils could obliterate a harvest seemingly overnight. Without pesticides or storage tech, an infestation could mean total ruin. Rodents are constant invaders, stealing grain from mud brick granaries that couldn't be sealed well. Disease spread quickly in these damp storage areas, both among stored food and among humans. And because the Mesopotamian farmer lived so close to the animals he raised, sheep, goats, cattle, zoonotic diseases were a part of life. Coughs, fevers, rashes, all common, all untreated. There were no antibiotics, no doctors for the poor, just prayers to gods who rarely seemed to listen. And speaking of those gods, nature's wrath was interpreted as divine punishment. So, every environmental catastrophe, flood, drought, disease, was seen as a failure in religious devotion. If your barley drowned, maybe you didn't sacrifice enough. If your child fell sick, maybe the gods were angry. The priests capitalized on this fear, demanding more offerings and rituals. So after a long, miserable day tending dying crops, a farmer had to show up at a temple, hands empty, head bowed, and pretend everything was fine while giving the last of his grain to a smiling priest. And then came the heat. Southern Mesopotamia could reach unbearable temperatures, especially during harvest. With no shade, no protective gear, and no concept of heat stroke, farmers regularly collapsed in their fields. The clay soil baked hard under the sun, cracking like broken skin. Dust storms would rise, turning the air into a choking, blinding nightmare. Your body would ache from bending, your hands raw from tools that barely helped, your lungs filled with dirt, and still, you had to keep going, because to stop meant hunger. And when the workday ended, you didn't go home to rest. You checked the canals, chased off predators, prayed the granary didn't collapse in the night, and worried about tomorrow's weather. Even animals posed threats. Wild boars trampled crops. Snakes slithered through reeds. Scorpions hid beneath stones. Every step was a risk. Night didn't bring peace, it brought fear. Many families lived in simple reed or mud brick huts with little protection from the elements or predators. Rain could melt a home in hours. Roofs collapsed, floors flooded, and diseases thrived in the standing water. Malaria, dysentery, parasites. There was no shortage of ways the environment reminded you just how expendable your life was. There's also the psychological weight of unpredictability. Imagine not knowing whether the rain will come or whether your entire village will be washed away. Imagine knowing that if your crops fail, there is no help coming, only the tax man. Imagine a life where the very earth beneath your feet betrays you. That was the reality for the Mesopotamian farmer. The gods didn't save them. The priests didn't protect them. And nature certainly didn't care. Instead of being nurtured by their environment, these early farmers were constantly in a state of battle against it. And when they lost, which they often did, the consequences were catastrophic. Entire communities collapsed when their land turned to salt. Families were torn apart when fathers were sold into servitude to repay debts after a poor harvest. And history, while remembering the kings and builders of ziggurats, forgot these nameless, exhausted souls who worked until their bodies broke. Even in death, nature claimed them quickly. Burials were shallow, often washed away by rains or disturbed by shifting soil. Their bodies disappeared into the earth they tried so hard to tame. They became part of the land, unmarked, unnamed, unremembered. And this was no isolated experience. For centuries, across thousands of miles, this same tragedy unfolded again and again. A farmer praying for rain, breaking his back in cursed fields, hoping this season would be different, only to suffer the same cruel fate. It's easy to romanticize the ancient world, to think of Mesopotamia as a land of wisdom, writing, and progress. But progress for whom? Not for the farmer who never learned to write. Not for the child who died from a waterborne disease. Not for the wife who buried her husband and then worked his field alone. Nature, for the Mesopotamian farmer, was not a mother, it was a monster. And the scariest part? There was no escaping it. This wasn't just farming. It was a lifelong survival game against an opponent that changed the rules every day. In segment 4, we'll unravel how even community life, something that should have brought support and safety, often added more weight to the already unbearable load of the ancient Mesopotamian farmer. Because in a world where everyone's struggling to survive, even your neighbors could become your enemies if the rivers, the soil, the sun, and the state weren't enough to crush the Mesopotamian farmer. The very community that surrounded them often completed the job. In segment 4, we examine how social dynamics, distrust, exploitation, and the burden of collective punishment made even close-knit villages feel like psychological traps, where isolation existed in the middle of a crowd, and your neighbors could become your enemies at the drop of a sheaf of barley. At first glance, one might assume that ancient Mesopotamian farming villages offered solidarity, teamwork, and mutual aid, but this idealized image falls apart under the weight of pressure, scarcity, and fear. Every person in a farming community was locked into an economy that pitted survival against compassion. Land was often communally allocated, yes, but unevenly. Wealthier families, or those with ties to scribes, overseers, or temples often received the most fertile plots, while poor families, those without connections, were stuck with salt-ridden, flood-prone, or less irrigated lands. And if you couldn't meet your yield quota, it wasn't just your family that suffered. It could bring shame or extra burden upon your neighbors. This encouraged resentment, rivalry, and betrayal. It wasn't uncommon for farmers to inform on each other, reporting hidden grain stores, falsified harvest amounts, or secret land arrangements. Whistleblowers often received leniency from tax collectors or temple agents, creating a chilling incentive to trade your neighbor's suffering for your own security. Imagine working beside someone all year, sweating under the same brutal sun, only for them to hand over your name for an infraction you didn't commit, or one you committed just to feed your child. This climate of suspicion fractured communities, eroded trust, and turned cooperation into cautious coexistence. Group punishment was another cruel reality. If a canal broke and the fields flooded, the entire community could be held responsible. If one family failed to deliver their quota, others might have to make up the shortfall. Suddenly, your neighbor's sick ox or spoiled crop was your problem, and you hated them for it. Community work projects, like rebuilding canals or maintaining city walls, also became battlegrounds of inequality. Wealthier landowners could hire labor or offer bribes to avoid these responsibilities, while poorer farmers had no choice but to abandon their fields during vital seasons just to comply with the corvée labor system. This deepened class divides and created long-lasting animosity between different social tiers, even within the same village. And then there were the temple elites, often born into privilege, but embedded within farming communities as overseers, scribes, or land administrators. These figures weren't external rulers. They lived among the farmers, walked the same dusty paths, and pretended to be one of them. But they had literacy, connections, and state power behind them. They enforced tax collection, oversaw disputes, recorded legal contracts, and ensured that the temple and palace got their share. Any farmer who couldn't read or write was at their mercy. The village scribe might be your neighbor, but he could also be the one who doctored a tablet, misrecorded your harvest, or quietly increased your debt tally in exchange for temple favor. In essence, the farmer lived in a surveillance state without cameras. Only clay tablets, gossip, and betrayal. And while one might hope that extended families offered comfort, even this wasn't guaranteed. Land disputes within families were common. Inheritance laws were strict but complicated, and without documentation. The sons of different wives could argue for control of plots, animals, or homes. Fights broke out over water rights, tools, and grain. It wasn't uncommon for brothers to take each other to temple court. In some tragic cases, families sold each other into debt slavery just to survive. A father might lease out his son, or a husband might surrender his wife and children to appease a creditor. These weren't the acts of evil men. They were the desperate decisions of people cornered by a ruthless system. The emotional cost of these decisions was devastating. Marriages strained under the pressure of poverty and relentless labor. Children grew up not in playful innocence, but in a state of constant anxiety, watching their parents break under the weight of taxes, debts, and illness. Social roles were rigid. Women were expected to maintain the home, help with agriculture, process food, care for animals, and produce children, all while staying obedient to their husbands. There was little room for rest, let alone autonomy. And if a woman's husband died, she often faced a terrifying question: remarry quickly, sell the land, or risk destitution. Widows were vulnerable and sometimes forcibly remarried to male relatives, not for love, but to retain property within the family. Children, too, were assets more than individuals, put to work as soon as they could carry water or harvest grain, often without education or future beyond the same life of hardship. The village festivals, which might seem like a brief relief from this monotony, often served to reinforce social hierarchies. While the whole village participated in rituals and processions, the elite dined in special tents or near the temple steps. The best portions of sacrificial animals went to the priests. Farmers got broth and grain cakes, if anything at all. The rituals were intended to show unity, but in practice, they displayed division. Even the gods were more generous to the wealthy, or so the priests claimed. This built a spiritual inferiority complex in the lower classes, convincing them that their suffering was not only deserved but divinely ordained. Psychological despair crept into the daily lives of these farmers. The absence of hope, the normalization of betrayal, and the sheer monotony of backbreaking repetition without progress slowly destroyed morale. A man who questioned the system risked punishment. A woman who complained risked being cast out. So they internalized their suffering. They buried their thoughts as deep as their seeds, hoping maybe, just maybe, the next harvest would bring a little more food, a little less pain. The community, instead of lifting them up, often reminded them of everything they didn't have: status, control, voice, or freedom. And yet they carried on because there was no alternative. Life outside the village, on the run, without land, tools, or shelter was even worse. Bandits, wild animals, and starvation awaited beyond the canal walls. So the Mesopotamian farmers stayed. They endured the isolation of a crowd, the pain of silence, and the heartbreak of watching their neighbors, once friends, become threats, rivals, or enforcers. This wasn't just social suffering. It was a slow-burning collapse of everything that makes us feel human. In segment 5, we'll explore how early writing and record-keeping, one of Mesopotamia's greatest innovations, was weaponized against the very farmers who made civilization possible, turning literacy into a tool of oppression and turning people into numbers that of all the innovations to emerge from ancient Mesopotamia, none is more celebrated than the invention of writing. Cuneiform etched into clay tablets, often hailed as the dawn of recorded history. But for the average Mesopotamian farmer, writing wasn't a marvel. It was a muzzle, a trap, and a tool of absolute control. In this 5th segment of our brutal journey through the misery of Mesopotamian agricultural life, we reveal how writing, the very thing that gave civilization its memory, was weaponized to strip farmers of power, erase their voices, and cement a system that reduced human beings to numbers, quotas, and debts. It all began with accounting. The earliest cuneiform wasn't used for poetry or philosophy. It was used to track grain, livestock, labor, taxes, and transactions. And guess who those records focused on? Farmers. Every plot of land, every animal, every sack of barley was counted, calculated, and stored in clay by temple scribes. These scribes were part of the elite class, educated men who served the priests, kings, and officials. Farmers, on the other hand, were almost entirely illiterate. They could not read the records written about them, let alone challenge them. If a scribe noted that you owed 30 shekels of barley instead of 20, you had no way to prove otherwise. Your future, your freedom, your family stability, all hung on the whim of someone holding a stylus. And if you dared dispute it, you risked punishment or enslavement. Farmers weren't just tracked, they were categorized. Their names, land boundaries, yields, and family members were recorded in ledgers stored in temples and palace archives. The system ensured that your debt was eternal and inherited. You couldn't hide. You couldn't forget. The state never did. These records weren't just bureaucratic, they were binding. If a record stated that your field had underperformed, you were charged interest. If a scribe listed your ox as missing, you were accused of theft or negligence. If your name appeared in a debt register, you could be summoned, fined, or even lose your land. There were no appeals, no second opinions. The tablets spoke, and the tablets were law. And because these records lasted for generations, baked in clay and stored for eternity, your misfortunes haunted your children and grandchildren. This form of written surveillance created a society where the literate few dominated the illiterate masses. Scribes weren't just record keepers, they were power brokers. They could forge documents, favor the elite, and fabricate figures to ruin a family or reward a friend. And because writing was sacred, tied to divine order, challenging a scribe's account was seen as both a legal and spiritual offense. Farmers were forced to live with a constant sense of helplessness. They knew the ledgers could lie, but they had no voice to argue, no skills to read, and no status to resist. Their lives were silently controlled by a system they couldn't understand. And the cruelty didn't stop there. Even contracts, agreements for land leases, livestock trades, or labor arrangements, were written in cuneiform. The terms were rigid, often biased toward landlords and temple authorities. A farmer who signed a lease might unknowingly agree to astronomical interest rates, long-term obligations, or even labor service for generations to come. These tablets, stamped with cylinder seals, were virtually unbreakable bonds. And if you defaulted, the tablet was your jailer. Cuneiform was also used to track corvée labor, unpaid work demanded by the state. Your name could appear on a tablet requiring you to abandon your farm for weeks to dig a canal or build a temple wall. If you didn't show up, it was written as desertion. If you died while working, a line on a tablet noted your replacement. You became a number to be filled in, erased, and forgotten. And let's not forget the public humiliation. Some records were posted or read aloud in markets or temples. A farmer behind on taxes might hear his name called out in front of neighbors, accused of being lazy, dishonest, or cursed by the gods. His wife and children would endure the shame. His social standing would collapse. And this reputation, too, would be written down another invisible prison. The temple, the palace, and the wealthy merchants all relied on cuneiform to preserve their power. While they inscribed hymns, victories, and divine laws, the farmer's story was never written by him, only about him, usually to extract more from him. Even religious rituals were tracked with this cold system. If you missed an offering, it was documented. If your family failed to attend a festival, it was recorded. Faith, like farming, was monitored with clay and stylus. There was no aspect of farmer's life that wasn't reduced to data. The introduction of writing, rather than freeing humanity, created a new form of bondage, mental and social. It divorced knowledge from experience and gave power to those who could write over those who could not. A man who knew the sky, the soil, the rhythms of planting and harvest. He had no value in court, no say in city planning, no voice in history. And that is perhaps the most haunting part, that the people who built civilization with their hands were erased from its official memory. The stone monuments celebrate kings. The tablets speak the words of scribes. The stories glorify temples and gods. But the farmer, the broken, voiceless laborer beneath it all, is nowhere. His suffering is hidden behind the smooth lines of cuneiform, behind numbers and names and quotas that never tell the full horror. And so writing became not a torch of enlightenment, but a brand burned into the back of every Mesopotamian farmer, marking him, binding him, and ensuring he remained a silent gear in the grinding machine of empire. In segment 6, we'll turn our gaze toward gender and labor roles and how women, especially farmers' wives and daughters, suffered a uniquely punishing fate in this brutal society, carrying burdens that history barely remembers. If the life of a Mesopotamian farmer was defined by backbreaking labor, systemic exploitation, and natural cruelty, then the life of a farmer's wife or daughter was a quiet descent into invisibility, where work was doubled, recognition was non-existent, and suffering was woven into daily survival. In segment 6 of our deepening journey into the unbearable realities of ancient Mesopotamian farming life, we uncover the unique burdens carried by women, burdens compounded by patriarchal norms, economic desperation, and social expectations that reduce them to laborers, breeders, and sacrificial assets in a system that never saw their worth. While men toiled in the fields under the sun, women worked in the shadows, inside mud brick homes, around cooking fires, in weaving sheds, and by the family's grain stores. But don't mistake this as indoor comfort. This was relentless, exhausting, and physically punishing labor. A farmer's wife would rise before dawn, grind grain by hand using heavy stone querns, fetch water from distant canals or rivers, tend to livestock, clean soot-filled kitchens, and prepare meals with nothing but primitive tools and unpredictable food supplies. She would mend clothes, weave cloth from scratch, and assist in field work during harvest, while also caring for infants, the sick, and the elderly. There were no rest days, no praise, no time for herself. In a world without soaps, medicines, or sanitation, hygiene was a battlefield. Women cleaned dirty children, reused water, and fought daily to keep parasites and illness at bay with herbs and prayers. And through all this, they were expected to remain obedient, cheerful, and grateful, because their labor was not considered productive in the economic sense. It was invisible, unpaid, and unrecorded. Cuneiform tablets mention yields, debts, and oxen, but rarely the woman who carried a newborn while balancing a basket of grain on her head. Women had little say in family decisions. The husband or patriarch dictated financial choices, and marriages were arranged early, often in exchange for livestock, land, or as settlement for debt. A girl born into a farming household was a liability until she could be traded as a bride. Her value wasn't her voice or skills, but her womb. She was expected to produce sons, manage a household, and never challenge a role. And if she failed to bear children, especially sons, she could be divorced, shamed, or demoted within her own home. Polygamy, while not rampant, existed. A man with resources might take a second wife if the first couldn't produce heirs, or to gain more labor. This introduced internal hierarchies among women in the same household, leading to jealousy, stress, and psychological warfare behind closed doors. Domestic violence was rarely punished and often considered a private matter. A woman's bruises were invisible to the law, and her protests unheard by society. And when famine or debt struck, and they often did, the woman was usually the first to suffer. Her food portions were smaller. Her body withered faster. In the worst cases, she was the first to be sold. Numerous tablets reference debt slavery, where wives and daughters were handed over to creditors as repayment. The euphemism placed in service hides a darker truth. Many of these women were exploited, abused, or trafficked through temple systems masked as labor assignments. Some were forced into temple prostitution, ritualized sexual servitude disguised as religious duty. Their bodies became offerings to the gods, their voices muted behind sacred curtains. Others were absorbed into elite households, working without rest or reward. For women who remained at home, the emotional toll of farming life was immense. The constant fear of loss, of children to disease, of land to tax, of husbands to injury, hung over every day. Miscarriages were common due to overwork. Infant mortality rates were horrifying. Women gave birth in dark, unsanitary corners of their homes, without midwives or aid. If complications arose, both mother and baby often died. There were no birth records for poor farming families. No names carved in tablets, just blood in the dirt and silence. And yet women continued generation after generation. They passed down oral traditions, songs, herbal remedies, and survival techniques. They held families together while being erased from official history. Occasionally, a strong woman might rise through a temple position or as the matriarch of a powerful household, but these were rare exceptions. For most, Life was toil without thanks, labor without legacy. Even their deaths were unremarkable. Few received formal burials. Many were interred under floorboards or in shallow pits beside fields, remembered only by their children, if they survived. There were no statues, no hymns, no stories. In a society that recorded every brick laid for a ziggurat, not even a line was spared for the woman who fed the man who laid that brick. And religion offered little solace. Instead, she was expected to honor them with service, obedience, and sacrifice. Her suffering was framed as devotion. Her silence was seen as piety. Her death was not a tragedy. It was an inevitability. In the rare case that a woman resisted, refused a marriage, spoke out against mistreatment, or tried to flee, she was labeled disloyal, unclean, even cursed. The punishment? Banishment, beatings, or worse. So she stayed, stitched her mouth shut with ritual and routine, and tried to protect her children from a future that looked just like hers. The irony is that while male labor built the temples and plowed the land, it was female labor that sustained civilization's heartbeat. Yet she was never seen as a builder of civilization, only a caretaker of it. The female Mesopotamian farmer was a ghost in her own lifetime, a workhorse wrapped in linen, a vessel for others' needs, and a prisoner of dust, silence, and fate. In segment 7, we'll examine how sickness, injury, and the complete lack of medical care devastated farming families, and how the very environment they depended on became the breeding ground for plagues that punished the poor above all. If the Mesopotamian farmer was crushed beneath the weight of labor, droughts, debt, and social oppression, there was yet another brutal companion in his day-to-day life that made survival even more uncertain: disease and the complete lack of reliable medical care. In segment 7, we peel back the final layer of misery that plagued the ancient farming class. The daily terror of illness in a world where the body was as disposable as a broken tool, and where sickness didn't just mean suffering, it often meant death. To begin with, the environmental conditions of the Mesopotamian river valleys were a breeding ground for disease. Farmers lived in close quarters with livestock: sheep, goats, oxen, pigs, many of which carried parasites and bacteria that easily transmitted to humans. There was no separation between living quarters and barns, no sanitation systems, and very little understanding of how disease spread. Water sources were polluted with human and animal waste. Canals and irrigation ditches, while essential for crops, became stagnant pools of bacteria, breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and conduits for dysentery, typhoid, and parasitic worms. Every sip of water carried the threat of infection. Diarrheal diseases were among the most common and deadliest, especially for children. In a home where nutrition was already scarce, losing water through illness quickly led to dehydration and death. There were no rehydration salts, no antibiotics, no clean clinics, just herbal remedies passed down orally, prayers to gods like Gula, goddess of healing, and clay tablets inscribed with ritual incantations that promised divine protection but delivered little practical relief. When a Mesopotamian farmer became ill, work didn't stop. There were no sick days. If you couldn't work your land, no one worked it for you. Crops went unharvested, animals went unfed, and tax obligations didn't disappear. Illness often set off a chain reaction. A father struck with fever meant his wife had to shoulder the field work and domestic tasks, while children, already weakened by poor diets, were dragged into labor prematurely. The weakened family became more vulnerable to hunger, accidents, and predatory lenders. Even minor injuries became catastrophic. A simple cut from a farming tool, untreated, could become infected and fester in the relentless Mesopotamian heat. There were no antibiotics, no knowledge of sterilization. Open wounds invited flies, dirt, and bacteria. Farmers often suffered from tetanus-like symptoms, fevers, swelling, and sepsis, all without even knowing what those things were. Limbs would swell and blacken. People died slowly, in agony, with no one able to help. Some might seek a temple healer, but these priests practiced a mixture of spiritual ritual, guesswork, and herbalism. Diagnosis was based on omens, dreams, and the alignment of stars. Incantations were whispered over bowls of water. Animal entrails were examined for signs from the gods. Sickness wasn't just physical, it was believed to be punishment. The afflicted were often treated as cursed or spiritually unclean. This led to isolation, shame, and sometimes even banishment. Imagine being struck by a fever and then shunned by your neighbors for being touched by a demon. In this context, medical care became not just ineffective, but humiliating. And because most farming families had no wealth, they couldn't afford professional healing even when it was available. Temple-based healing often required offerings, goats, grain, labor. A family might go deeper into debt just trying to save a child. And if they failed to pay, the temple might seize property, land, or even take the child into servitude as payment. Disease didn't just harm the body, it fractured families. And while infectious diseases took their toll, chronic illnesses were also rampant. Decades of backbreaking labor led to arthritis, spinal damage, worn-down joints, and chronic pain. Malnutrition led to stunted growth, brittle bones, and weakened immune systems. Many farmers lived in constant discomfort, waking each day with swollen fingers, aching knees, and raw skin, yet still marching to the fields because to stop meant starvation. Women faced even grimmer prospects. Repeated childbirth without rest or medical aid caused torn muscles, infections, hemorrhaging, and prolapse. There were no midwives in many villages, no knowledge of postpartum care. After giving birth in filthy conditions, a woman might resume work within days. If she bled too much or developed fever, there was nothing to do but pray. And pray they did, because religion was the only health care the poor truly had. Temples offered sacred amulets, rituals, and statues believed to possess healing power. The sick would sleep in temple courtyards, hoping for dreams in which gods offered cures. They would leave offerings, anything they could spare, in hopes of divine mercy. Sometimes they got better, often they didn't. And when death came, it wasn't peaceful. There were no morphine-like sedatives, no palliative care. The sick lay in fevered agony, moaning on reed mats while their families tried to hide their panic and sorrow. Some might be smothered to end their suffering. Some simply faded, unseen, unremarked. They were buried in shallow graves near the home, or in some cases, simply abandoned to the elements when families couldn't perform proper rites. In particularly bad years, after floods, droughts, or locust plagues, disease spread like wildfire. Malnutrition weakened entire villages. One infected person could pass illness to dozens. There were no quarantines, no hospitals, just a slow, community-wide decay. And when the dead began to pile up, no records were kept of their names. There were no mass graves, just the quiet disappearance of entire families. The worst part, the Mesopotamian farmer knew this cycle. He had seen his neighbors die. He had seen his children fall sick. He lived with the constant fear that one cut, one cough, one fever might be the end. And yet, he kept going, because there was no alternative. To live in Mesopotamia as a farmer was to walk a tightrope stretched between exhaustion and extinction, with no safety net below. Segment 8 will explore how spiritual beliefs offered both comfort and manipulation, and how religion, while offering the illusion of salvation, ultimately trapped farmers in a cycle of fear, obedience, and sacrifice that deepened their suffering if disease, debt, famine, and labor weren't enough to define the unrelenting misery of the Mesopotamian farmer. There was one final, inescapable force that shaped every thought, every decision, and every sacrifice: religion. In segment 8 of our deep dive into the suffering buried beneath the birth of civilization, we examine how the spiritual life of the Mesopotamian farmer, far from offering peace or redemption, became a powerful tool of manipulation that enforced obedience, normalized pain, and made suffering seem not only inevitable but sacred. From birth, farmers were indoctrinated into a spiritual worldview that connected every aspect of life: weather, fertility, illness, war, harvests, and even social status, to the will of an invisible, omnipresent pantheon of gods. To live was to serve them, and to suffer was to be corrected by them. Gods like Enlil, Shamash, Ninhursag, Ishtar, and Marduk weren't loving protectors but feared rulers, quick to anger, demanding in devotion, and unpredictable in their wrath. Every flood, drought, disease, or bad harvest was attributed not to environmental causes or poor governance, but to divine displeasure. This belief alone kept farmers locked in a cycle of guilt and desperation, always trying to appease the gods with more offerings, more rituals, more suffering. Temples were not just places of worship. They were institutions of control. They owned the most land, commanded vast labor forces, and operated massive bureaucracies. The ziggurats, towering structures that symbolized a bridge between heaven and earth, were built with taxpayer labor, often by farmers during corvée work seasons, and maintained by offerings extracted from those who could barely feed their families. Farmers were required to donate grain, livestock, textiles, oil, beer, and labor, not only for festivals but regularly as a tithe. Failure to give meant divine displeasure, and divine displeasure was something every farmer feared more than even the tax collector. Priests, the supposed intermediaries between mortals and gods, enforced this system with eerie efficiency. They claimed to interpret omens, read the stars, decipher dreams, and relay the gods' demands. But in reality, they acted as power brokers, extracting wealth, labor, and blind loyalty in exchange for illusionary protection. For the farmer, a priest could determine his guilt or innocence, his eligibility for land leases, even the spiritual fate of his dead relatives. And if a priest said you'd anger God, you believed it, because to disbelieve meant isolation, spiritual danger, or punishment. Entire farming families lived in constant anxiety, praying their offerings were sufficient, their behavior pious enough, their children's actions not offensive to unseen divine watchers. Rituals were relentless and often cruel. There were purification rites that involved sleep deprivation, starvation, or even self-harm. Women were sometimes subjected to temple service, where sexual rituals were performed under the guise of sacred fertility. Men were expected to present their first harvests at the temple before feeding their own households. If your ox died, maybe you hadn't prayed hard enough. If a child got sick, perhaps you failed to pour enough oil into the sacred fire. The guilt was constant and deeply internalized. Worse still, religion justified hierarchy. Kings claimed to rule by divine appointment. Temple scribes enforced religious law, and priests interpreted omens in ways that always benefited the elite. If a wealthy landlord seized a poor farmer's land and offered it to the temple, the gods were pleased. If a farmer begged for leniency, he was accused of spiritual arrogance. And when misfortune struck the powerful, rituals were conducted, sacrifices made, and scribes recorded their righteousness to history. But when it struck the poor, it was seen as deserved punishment, a sign of impurity, laziness, or cosmic death. Farmers thus carried not only their physical burdens, but a spiritual stigma. They were told that their hard lives were part of a divine plan, that their misery on earth would be repaid in the afterlife, though even that was uncertain. Mesopotamian beliefs about the afterlife were grim. Unlike later religious traditions that promised paradise, the Mesopotamian underworld was a dark, dusty, miserable place where all souls, regardless of moral virtue, wandered aimlessly. The best one could hope for was a proper burial, periodic offerings from descendants, and the hope that no demons disturbed their rest. This bleak spiritual future didn't inspire hope, it inspired fear. Farmers worked not for heavenly reward, but to avoid divine wrath and social ruin. Religion became a spiritual treadmill. No matter how many sacrifices were made, the gods remained hungry, the priests remained powerful, and the farmer remained trapped. And this wasn't just metaphysical, it was woven into the law. Hammurabi's code, steeped in religious authority, enforced harsh punishments, with different outcomes depending on class and gender. If a farmer defaulted on a loan, lost a crop, or accidentally damaged temple property, he might be flogged, enslaved, or stripped of land. The law, claimed to be divinely inspired, offered no refuge. In fact, it institutionalized the suffering that temples preached was ordained by the gods. There were even curses inscribed on temple walls and tablets warning of divine vengeance on those who challenged the authority of priests or failed to fulfill their obligations. These curses weren't metaphorical. They terrified communities into compliance. And for those few who dared to doubt the system, isolation awaited. A man who skipped temple rituals, questioned a priest, or refused offerings might be cast out, labeled as impure or cursed. In a society where social support was essential for survival, being ostracized was a death sentence. Religion, in this sense, wasn't a source of community. It was a weaponized belief system, forged in fear and wielded by the elite. And yet, the farmers still knelt. They still burned incense. They still dragged their children to rituals, buried offerings in fields, tied amulets around their necks, and begged for blessings they knew might never come. Why? Because when you've lost control over land, weather, health, justice, and your own body, faith, however manipulated, is the only thing you can still hold. It is both prison and pillow, punishment and placebo. In segment 9, we will explore how, even after generations of oppression, rebellion was nearly impossible, and why farmers, despite their numbers, never truly escaped the wheel of suffering turning above them. After wading through the suffocating realities of natural disasters, relentless labor, brutal hierarchies, disease, exploitation, and weaponized religion, one might naturally ask, Why didn't the farmers rise up? Why didn't the very backbone of Mesopotamian society, the majority who plowed the fields and fed the temples and the kings, revolt against their tormentors? In segment 9, we confront the painful truth behind this absence of rebellion, and it reveals just how deeply entrenched, calculated, and psychologically binding the ancient systems of control truly were. The Mesopotamian farmer did not live in a vacuum of ignorance or bliss. He understood suffering. He understood oppression. But the tools of rebellion, organization, communication, unity, and power were stripped from him before he ever had the chance to learn how to wield them. The entire societal structure of Mesopotamia was designed to isolate and divide the lower classes, particularly farmers, who were geographically scattered across vast rural stretches, locked into land leases tied to temples or elite landlords, and psychologically conditioned from birth to accept hardship as destiny. There were no written pamphlets to stir revolution, no mass communication, no leaders who rose from the mud brick huts, because literacy and influence belonged only to the scribes and priests. The only people who could read, write, and coordinate were also the people who benefited most from the status quo. And so, while the idea of resistance burned quietly in many, the reality was that organizing even a village-scale uprising was nearly impossible. Fear was the main weapon of the ruling class. Farmers who complained or resisted were labeled troublemakers. And under laws like Hammurabi's Code, those labeled rebellious faced amputations, branding, forced labor, or death. Even suspicion of conspiracy could result in punishment, not just for the accused, but for their families. The concept of collective punishment was deeply ingrained. If one farmer failed to meet his quota, his neighbors paid. If one family spoke against a priest, the entire lineage could be shamed. This fear turned neighbors into enforcers, not allies. It fractured potential movements before they could form. Furthermore, the corvée labor system, where farmers were periodically conscripted to build canals, temples, or city walls, served not only to maintain infrastructure, but also to shuffle populations, keep the poor disoriented, and prevent the formation of local bonds strong enough to resist authority. It was a deliberate strategy. Keep the working class too tired, too scattered, and too dependent to unite. Religious doctrine sealed the chains. From birth, farmers were taught that the gods chose kings, that priests were divine intermediaries, and that one's position in life was a reflection of divine will. To rise against the temple was to rise against the gods. This wasn't just blasphemy, it was existential doom. Suffering wasn't injustice, it was sacred correction. Even in the face of cruelty, farmers internalized guilt rather than anger. When crops failed, they blamed themselves, not the system. When taxed beyond their means, they believed they had displeased the divine. This spiritual manipulation extinguished the moral fuel necessary for rebellion. And in the rare cases when rebellion did surface, recorded sparingly in state-sponsored chronicles, it was swiftly and brutally crushed. Armed resistance was futile. Farmers were not soldiers. They had no weapons, no training, and no strategy. The cities employed professional militias loyal to kings and priests, equipped with bronze tools, chariots, and legal authority to quash dissent. A farmer with a sickle stood no chance. His field would be burned, his home razed, his family enslaved or slaughtered, and his memory erased from the clay tablets of history. Rebellion wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. And the cost was never just personal. It reverberated through entire communities, deterring future acts of defiance. Some might argue that there were micro-rebellions, passive resistance through false reporting of yields, hiding grain, or fleeing into the wilderness. These acts certainly occurred, but they were individual, desperate, and short-lived. A fleeing farmer became a fugitive, chased by temple agents and bounty hunters. With no land, no community, and no protection, such people often died in the wilderness or were captured and enslaved. Escape was an illusion, and perhaps the most tragic truth is this. Many farmers believed this was all life could offer. Generation after generation, sons watched their fathers bend under the same yoke. Daughters watched their mothers age before 30, and families passed down not wealth, but coping mechanisms. How to survive droughts, how to stretch rations, how to make peace with the gods, how to bear pain silently. Over time, this intergenerational suffering bred resignation, not rebellion. The human spirit can endure great pain, but when that pain is made sacred, hereditary, and invisible, when no alternate path is ever presented, then rebellion becomes not just unlikely, but unimaginable. And so, the Mesopotamian farmer stayed in his place. He plowed the earth with blistered hands. He gave the temple his barley. He whispered prayers in the dark. And he died quietly, with no history, no justice, and no monument. Just another forgotten soul swallowed by the system that claimed to serve the gods but really served only itself. In segment 10, we will conclude this haunting journey by pulling back to look at the long-term legacy of this misery, how the suffering of the Mesopotamian farmer laid the foundation for all future civilizations, and how echoes of his plight still exist today, hidden beneath the modern sheen of progress. Yes, we reach the final chapter in our haunting journey through the life of a Mesopotamian farmer. We now zoom out, not to escape the horror, but to understand its enduring legacy. Because the truth is, the world we live in today, our cities, our systems, our very concept of civilization, stands upon the calloused, cracked, and buried backs of those anonymous men and women who toiled in silence over 5,000 years ago. In segment 10, we reflect on how the institutionalized suffering of Mesopotamian farmers became a template for human societies to come, and why, despite all our modern advances, echoes of their pain still ripple through the present. The brutal hierarchy, the weaponization of literacy, the manipulation of religion, the taxation systems, the state surveillance, the criminalization of poverty, the gender oppression, and the conversion of human labor into state wealth. These weren't just Mesopotamian nightmares. They were prototypes. We still measure value and productivity. We still monitor people through data systems far more advanced, but just as impersonal. We still see farmers, the ones who feed the world, as some of the poorest and most ignored. The very structure of centralized power, codified law, and state control that Mesopotamia perfected became the model for empires, kingdoms, and eventually nation-states. Their clay tablets have become our databases. Their temple taxes have become our modern economic systems. Their divine kings became modern corporations and political elites, still demanding offerings from the laboring masses, still holding the keys to justice, education, and opportunity. And the worst part? Like their Mesopotamian ancestors, modern workers often don't realize how deeply they are embedded in a machine designed not to serve them, but to survive because of them. The Mesopotamian farmer didn't choose his misery, but neither do many of us. We inherit debt, inequality, and exhaustion, dressed up in newer clothes, wrapped in the illusion of freedom. The long hours worked by modern farmers, factory laborers, migrant workers, and low-income employees in the global economy are eerily similar in structure, if not in form. Overworked, underpaid, undervalued, and often invisible to those in power. Their names are still missing from the monuments. Their lives still absent from official history. And while we may have more technology, more knowledge, and more access than ancient Mesopotamians ever dreamed of, the machinery of civilization remains disturbingly familiar. It consumes the many to feed the few. The myth that suffering is noble, that obedience is divine, and that hierarchy is natural. All of these toxic legacies can be traced directly back to that floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates. In school books, Mesopotamia is celebrated as the cradle of civilization. But what kind of civilization rests on this much misery? What kind of progress begins with so much pain? The world's first cities were not places of prosperity for all, but mechanisms of extraction. The birth of writing was not for art, but for accounting. The first governments were not protectors, they were collectors. And at the heart of it all, always was the farmer, bent, bleeding, faithful, forgotten. Yet, within that bleak truth is also a quiet resilience. The Mesopotamian farmer did not rebel, but he endured through storms, taxes, curses, plagues, and poverty. He found ways to survive, raise families, teach the soil, and create life in a world that gave him nothing. That persistence, unrecorded, unwritten, uncelebrated, is the real miracle of civilization that IT is not the ziggurats or the laws or the cuneiform tablets we should honor. Is the people who built them, fed them, died for them. And so, as we end this series, we ask not just how they suffered, but what we've done with that inheritance. Have we broken the wheel? Or merely polished its spokes? Do we see the suffering behind our comfort? Do we recognize the ancient systems still alive in our policies, our economies, our cultures? Or do we, like the scribes of old, only record what the powerful want remembered? Let this be a call, not just to look backward in pity, but forward in awareness. The Mesopotamian farmer may be gone, but his burden lives on, in fields, factories, and forgotten villages across the world. It is up to us to finally write the history that includes him, not as a number, a quota, or a cursed soul, but as a human being who deserved better. Let us remember not just the inventions of Mesopotamia, but the cost of those inventions. Not just the glory, but the grief. Not just the cradle of civilization, but the cradle of suffering upon which that civilization rocked itself to power. Because only then, only when we see the full picture, can we begin to build a world that does not repeat it. Thank you for walking through this difficult history. If this series moved you, consider subscribing to the channel, sharing it with someone curious, and commenting where you're watching from. Let's not allow the voices of the forgotten to stay buried any longer.